Welcome back to the Asset Horizon podcast. This is Craig here. This week, we are highlighting the introductory comments from our most recent public panel discussion for the Asset Horizon Research Commons, which we called University of Excess. In this discussion, the AHRC draws attention to the waves of austerity that have not only hit philosophy departments and humanities departments more generally at universities in the UK, but now are coming for everybody. This is a story all too common in places afflicted by what remains of neoliberalism, accelerated under the austerity programs of the new right in places like the United States. Given our platform and our reach, we were approached by Stevphen Shukaitis of Minor Compositions to host this event. And speaking of events like these, we have a free public panel this week called Fanon and Anders on Revolution, featuring Nicholas de Warren and Tyreek MacGeorge. This panel takes figures and themes from our summer series of courses and collides them in a public debate and presentation exploring prospects for revolution in an age of technological capture. Please attend. Like we said, it's free. And one of the goals of the Asset Horizon Research Commons is to facilitate more conversations like these as we flourish as a sustainable alternative to the university. Chase the links in the show notes and be sure to subscribe to our Patreon as a free or contributing subscriber so you can get updates about events like these. Okay, let's take a moment to listen to the presenters at University of Excess.
Welcome, everybody, to the most recent of Asset Horizon Research Commons free public panel, with one we're calling the University of Excess. And I'm just going to give a brief lead-off before we go over today's speakers. That is Stevphen Shukaitis from Minor Compositions, John Preston, former Executive Dean of the University of Essex, and McRobbie, a cultural theorist and Professor Emerita at Goldsmith University, and Giovanni Mormont, who's a lecturer in social design at the University of Edinburgh. So I just want to begin just by thanking everyone again for coming and sort of getting a bit of a history of where this event came from. So this event originally came together from a conversation between myself and Stephen, and it wasn't simply a pun on the name University of Essex, from which he pitched a rather brilliant sort of Bataille-esque title, the University of Excess. However, this did not simply emerge from a dedication to wordplay, but because the assault on higher education is itself a catastrophe of waste, of surplus, of use. In short, it's a crisis of value. There is a notion of social worth behind every of the cut and closure that we're seeing. Even in departments such as Essex's Business School, where they have been repeatedly successful at securing external funding, this has not saved them from cuts, nor is this solely a problem for the humanities. So the latest announcement in the UK regarding quote-unquote strategic priorities grant funding has not only dropped support for history, but also for courses such as nursing and computing. It's not a case that in the humanities we can sort of plead our case and say, our subjects are useful, we can bear exchange value, please exploit us. These universities and these economies know that they can. Ultimately, those remaining after these cuts will have to apply for double the external funding and produce double the research, or risk being replaced by one of the thousands of people qualified to replace them for lower or equal pay. These redundancies weaponize the fact that nobody is too good to go as a warning against workers and worker militancy. Your field ultimately only matters to them as a location of funds, of grant money. Education is in excess not only of the extraction of value in the reproduction of the university, but also in relation to its ultimate end product, graduate labourers. As the philosopher Billy Cashmore summarises in her article about the closure of our own department over at Kingston, quote, "The claim uniformly is that we, as a society, cannot waste time and money on education. At least this is the case for the greatest portion of society, those in the precarious position of being rendered unemployable and thus surplus." If universities do not produce employable subjects, and the reasoning here is that even productive parts of the university can be cut, because production is posited as the sole end of study. This isn't even the crisis for universities. If you have less staff and less courses, coupled with a racist, hostile border regime for students from abroad, then this will devastate the economies in those regions that depend on universities. We might even see a collapse in the economic and social reproduction of certain towns, comparable to that of the destruction of towns centered around manufacturing and mining jobs under Thatcherism. The method in many ways is comparable. Universities are under attack not only economically, but they're also under attack ideologically. They are seen as sites of subversiveness. Now, this does not mean that the university is an inherently subversive institution, but rather, as Fred Moten and Stefano Hani taught us, they are, or were at least, places of refuge in which resources for collective study and educational empowerment can be expropriated. But what if the university is becoming surplus to the requirements of study itself, of education? If bringing yourself as a productive labourer to the university is the price for being able to provide a kind of critical thinking or insurgent education, then Moten and Hani concludes that both critical intellectual life and university labour mutually exceed each other. I quote, "The subversive intellectual came under false pretenses, with bad documents, out of love. Her labour is as necessary as it is unwelcome. The university needs what she bears, but cannot bear what she brings." Now, what is it that we bring in terms of university context? I'm going to quote Cashmore again, because she writes that the humanities, especially philosophy, often deals with initially incomprehensible ideas and texts at almost every moment of their teaching. And so, strictly speaking, this incomprehensibility, we deal with a lot of Deleuze and Hegel and the like and Derrida, it means that their value always exceeds their use, their employability. There remains a moment in this education which is constitutively unemployable, and this affirms precisely this value. The demand for new spaces of education, for a new undercommons, a new para-academia, contains within itself, I'm going to argue, a utopian demand for a life fit for living beyond employment. Therefore, at the AHRC, we've convened this panel to study the crisis and to study what comes next for what I would like to call the defiant luxury of education. And to start off, I want to begin with Stephen. Please, Stephen, if you could just introduce yourself and tell us about your experiences in university and what you think about the crisis for the future of study today.
Thank you, Adam. Long-time listener, first-time caller. I'm happy to be here. For the past 18 years, I've worked at the University of Essex, and I'm the editor of the imprint Minor Composition, which is a part of Autonomous Media. So let me get into what I wanted to talk about. I'll start with the main idea, then we'll go through a series of steps. And my main thing I want to get to is the idea that what does it mean when doing everything the neoliberal university asks you, claims to value, doesn't secure your position, and increasingly doesn't even seem to secure anymore the reproduction of the university itself? So what I wanted to suggest is that universities, they aren't just simply becoming more neoliberal, they aren't simply becoming more hostile to critical thought, they aren't becoming more financially constrained, but all of these things are true. I want to suggest that there's a certain kind of terminal end stage of university management logic that can't even deal with its own conditions and has to constantly perform cruelty in order to say it's doing something. And that's why, as a segue, I think it's more important to talk about non-institutional spaces. So that's my core argument. So, okay, back to the beginning. I've worked at Essex for 18 years. There are 11 other people in my department with myself who are being made redundant. Now, there's always a temptation to want to go into the details and tell you all our stories. And we could, but in a certain way that wouldn't be super interesting to get lost in the procedural details, because what we're dealing with isn't unique at all. It's happening at many places in the UK, across the US. It's not unique, right? But what I want to focus on is what I'm seeing that's interesting about the shifting in these kinds of attacks and what that tells us about the present. So we're seeing things like departments closing, programs disappearing, redundancy being normalized. We're in a state of kind of a permanent crisis management. And so what do we make of that? What's different? Now, what I've noticed over the past few months since I've been getting told at the end of July, by the way, you're out the door, is that I get from comrades many of these responses I would expect. Oh, this is academic neoliberalism, it's attack on critical scholarship, universities care only about the market. Now, all these are in part true. But I think, how would I put this? I think they also contain something of we would call a thought-terminating cliche, where it's true enough to sound good, but it sort of blocks off understanding what's different about this moment. and what we have to understand about the moment. So it's not only that all those things are true, but there's something else about it. And what I'm interested about it is how, what it shows is how universities are attacking the things they claim to value. They're destroying the very capacities that make them possible. So here's the paradox, and this is why I don't think it's purely neoliberal. Because if you look at the people at Essex who are being fired, we're not your typical critical humanities scholars. We literally work at a business school. Like, you know, this is like my opposite of Ashok Harbam. Like, we're literally management marketing scholars. So we're talking about people who have designed and run programs that recruit students. So they have students who have developed international partnerships, who have been part of senior university governance, who have bucket loads of publishing, lots of funding, supervised students, like done all the work of creating the things that universities claim they care about. Yet they're like, yeah, be gone. And that's the thing which brings you to want to rethink this moment is why is that happening? So to be clear, this is not a moment where we're seeing people who have refused the neoliberal university's demands of being productive are being let go. It's not people who weren't productive, who didn't produce stuff, who didn't build research cultures. People who did all those things and are fired anyways. So how do we make sense of you do the right things, you lose your job anyway? So this is what I think is the sort of shift we're seeing in, let's say, university management at this point. And this is where we're going to get a bit more speculative, because maybe this is where John can come in later to tell us more about how much my speculations seem accurate. I think it can be rather easy to think that university managers, that VCs have lots of power and agency. And there is some truth to that, but there's also some ways in which they're very constrained. I think for a lot of university managers, at this point, they're less choosing what to do and more having to work to sort of service the things demanded of financial covenants, dodgy deals with sort of, shell companies who make build dorms and then they expect money back in return, loan covenants, pension things. So what I think this shows is the way that Bifo talks about how the economy runs what we call economic, I can never say this word right, automatisms, basically sort of like stripping up agency of financial decisions. So what I'm thinking is, if you think about this kind of a techno-pessimist argument, techno-pessimist acceleration argument where everything is being subordinated to sort of labor becoming not so useful, I'm thinking we're kind of seeing this, but also in a way which affects university management as well. Like, they know that decisions they make are not going to actually improve the situation. So it's almost like, well, if we can't do that, we'll have to perform that we're doing something. It gets to kind of where, how do you put it? You're rearranging the chairs on the Titanic, not because that's going to make the boat not sink, but because rearranging chairs is now a key metric performance for university management. So they could say, I've done the thing. I made a program. Some numbers went up and down. And then people can go and get a nice job somewhere else, a golden handshake, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't actually produce benefits, but it is the sort of performativity demanded of senior management in universities at this point. And so what I find really intriguing is when that sort of managerial performativity is kind of detached from actually affecting anything positively. In a certain ways, this kind of doesn't make it about bad apples. It's almost like this weird shift in the system that demands this kind of shift, this kind of behavior. Now, the reason why I think this is important is if we go back to Harney and Moten, the way they suggested that you could find a kind of ambivalent refuge in the university. You go into the university, for instance, and steal resources, steal stuff, right? There's just less stuff to steal. And if you want to find refuge, the demands of your psychological condition, your labor, your time, your effort are so much more higher demanding and quite frankly kind of oppressive than they were previously. So it's seeming to me that kind of sort of inside and against approach, which I held on to for many years, is becoming more and more difficult because of the way that before it was, again, it seemed that if you did all of the right things, you could find a little space for yourself and hope no one noticed for a while. And I think that's starting to work a lot less than it used to. And that's why I want to suggest that there's something more pressing about thinking about if the ambivalent refuge of the person who stays with the university but actually leaves mentally or psychologically is no longer possible, then that means finding ways to create structures outside of universities is all the more important. And I think things like Asset Horizon are one of those things. I would like to think that the work I've done with minor compositions could be a small example of that. I think there are many para-academic institutions, which we'll hear more about, which I think are doing this kind of thing already. But the question is that if we're going to see people who previously were taking refuge in the university being kicked out of it, coming out into these spaces, which I think are super valuable and important, there's a question of ongoing conditions of reproduction outside of the university and what is necessary to support the continued existence of these spaces and people's livelihoods as they want to continue researching, writing, teaching, doing all these things, but in different spaces. And that is, I'm going to say more difficult because it's a daunting proposition, as anyone who's tried to start an independent business or venture knows, and then discovers that you're sort of hustling all the time. I'm sure you know this, Adam and Craig. You probably know it all too well. But that's the thing that I think we should really think about is if there's these shifts in the university system where taking refuge isn't possible as much anymore, and we're going to have to find other spaces, then how do we think about organizing those spaces in networks or not by themselves or in any ways that find ways to sort of continually reproduce themselves in a way that makes sense, that doesn't romanticize precarity, but makes the best of it can. And so this for me is why I suggested the idea of the university of excess. Like we're being literally chucked out. We are literally being treated as excess. But the thing that's being chucked out is actually the thing which is actually, in theory, should be the most integral to the running of the institution. So what does it tell you when institutions are chucking out the thing that actually does the thing it's supposed to do? And when that is rendered excess, when it rendered redundant, how can we think about reproducing that in other forms, or at least that's the positive things about that labor and that activity outside of universities?
Thank you, Stephen, so much. Next, we're going to go to John. Thank you so much.
Hello. I'm known as the former executive dean of the University of Essex, Faculty of Social Science. I'm also emeritus professor of sociology. I'm no longer employed by Essex. And I'm going to give you a bit of biography, but also within that, try and spin in something about the neoliberal turn, because I've worked in education since the 1990s. I was originally a teacher in post-16, further education, sixth form sector. And for me, I think the big moment for neoliberalism, by the way, I think universities have always been in crisis and universities have always been agents of capital, right? Before that, it was state capital. So it was about imperialism, it was about fighting wars or getting labour power for certain industrial sectors. So to sort of paraphrase Stephen Ball, there was no golden age of universities where you can go back and say, wasn't it brilliant when universities were run by Oxford academics and were highly elitist? You know, there's no kind of golden age, and that's definitely not my kind of background in coming to universities. So the big sort of start of this was the Further Higher Education Act of 1992. Not to get too nerdy about it, but that made FE colleges, sixth form colleges, and higher education institutions corporations. So a weird sort of corporation in the UK. No one really knew what that meant in a way, but it made, in Glenn Rakowski's terms, the people who ran them the human representatives of capital. Before, they might have been academics or teachers, etc. Now they had to represent capital. The finances had to be balanced. They had a certain autonomy. They didn't have the same kind of pressures to run things in the same way. And so that kind of unleashed universities a bit and FE colleges to do more of what they wanted. And they broke away from local education authorities all the way from the state a bit. And I first came to universities in 2000. I was working at the Institute of Education as a precarious researcher, just done precarious contracts. I'd left teaching, and I went between universities until 2017 when I was got my redundancy notice from the University of East London. So there was another there's been lots of waves of redundancies affecting different universities. And it's quite interesting the way they've affected. That time it was the new universities. Now it's more kind of mid-range universities. It seems to have moved to the Russell Group as well. But these kind of waves move through. I think it was to do with the teachers' pension scheme at the time and some kind of financial mismanagement. I know that UEL at the time was opening overseas campuses for international students, and I think it got in a lot of trouble for that. So there was kind of the period of expansion, some contraction. And I got a job at Bath Spa University. I was commuting down on a Monday and coming back. So my family were in Colchester on a Thursday. It was less wages. And I was desperate to get back to Colchester. I mean, okay, academic biographies seem to be about, I wanted to go to the University of Essex because blah, blah, blah. I needed to live in the southeast of England. And the job came up in Colchester, but it was a management job. It was a faculty dean job. And I think people apply for those jobs for two reasons. One, they're ambitious, and two, they're desperate for various reasons, because either their careers are a bit floundering, and maybe, I don't know, mine was, or they need to be there for some reason. They need to do it for a certain reason. So I took the faculty dean job, and it was the time of expansion. So there was lots of international students, and universities were recruiting lots of international students. And to go back to Stephen's point about why universities are doing this, I think you can look at why universities are doing it in terms of accumulation and crisis. So it was a time of accumulation. It was expansion. There was surplus. So vice-chancellors were willing to give people the freedom to criticise them. It was the type of vice-chancellor who was expanding. They were bold in terms of building loads of campuses in the UK, expanding their kind of private property as well. Then the contraction came, and for Essex, it came because we had our CAS licence suspended to recruit international students. The previous vice-chancellor asked me if I'd be the executive dean, and I said, well, I will, as long as you're not willing to make redundancies. So he gave me his word he wouldn't do that. But he then left within about 4 months. So I don't know what that word meant. And then we were in a period of decline. We got a new vice-chancellor, and I think the new breed of vice-chancellors are the vice-chancellors for that time of decline. So the accumulation's over, now capital's in crisis. You've got the type of vice-chancellor who manages decline. And, Stephen's talked about rearranging the deck chairs, and I'd say, yeah, there's a lot of that going on, or was going on. But really, they wanted to get people out of the way who would complain about how the deck chairs were being rearranged. So I think critical for anyone who was critical of the management process was then shut down. Whether they were successful or not, whether they had 4-star ref publications, whether they were bringing in income. Because the whole thing was, how do we dismantle this huge expansion? So capital's kind of in that phase of decline. I resigned from the university when redundancies were going to be announced by the Vice-Chancellor, and stepped down from the Executive Dean to go back to the department and join my colleagues in UCU striking against the redundancies. But that's really neither here nor there. Or maybe it is there, because I think that the new type of manager that's required in universities was not me. So I think you can still explain it in terms of neoliberalism. You might explain it in terms of like tertiary capitalism, this is the end stage, or Gore capitalism. So there's actually profit to be made in the bloodiness of these redundancies. So the vice-chancellor with the most blood on their hands and in their teeth is seen as the most successful, and that's the person who's going to dismantle universities. So in terms of the future of universities, I mean, I like to go back to Marx's thing about education being a sausage factory, and to think about, we're going to stretch the metaphor a long way here, what sort of sausage is being produced? And it was labour power. It was labour power. Now it's student fee income or research income. Academics think of themselves like they're small commodity producers, like they're artisans, spinning something. They can't see the big sausage that they're making, the ref return or the student income that's coming in. Whereas the university management can see all of that. So the university now is just about bringing in money in the here and now. It doesn't really necessarily care whether students get jobs. And there's some kind of metric about that. So it's really just become a highly functional capitalist institution, because it's about maximizing some kind of income, and it's about kind of downsize and get rid of that anyone who stops that kind of critical thought away from it. Now, I've written a book on AI in the future of universities, and I don't really think there's a future in the university as a corporate institution in the UK, as certainly anywhere that has any kind of freedom of thought. I do think there's a future in cooperatives, in free universities, in locally run community education initiatives, and hopefully one of the, I wouldn't call it an upside, but one of the things about capitalism, it produces its own gravediggers. And I think in terms of the redundancies, there's going to be a lot of academics with a lot of knowledge who don't want to work in the system anymore or can't work in the system anymore, who will do something with that to set up something else. So I think there is a future of study, but I do not see it at all at zero in any corporate university at the moment. And we can pretend that we're finding spaces, but as Stephen said, the ship is being dismantled. Those spaces aren't existing anymore. And where those spaces do exist, these bloodthirsty Gore capitalist vice-chancellors will find those spaces. If anyone speaks out against the university, they'll be made redundant. They'll be shut down and they'll be made redundant. So, I'm pessimistic about the future of the university capitalist institution. It'd be like asking me, how optimistic are you about the future of Tesla as a car manufacturer to bring about communism? And I'd say, well, it might produce some gravediggers, but I'm not that optimistic that there's going to be people hiding away in cupboards, plotting some kind of insurrection. So, yeah, that's my 2 cents worth on the future of universities.
No, thank you so much, John. No, a dose of the old pessimism of the intellect is often, the splinter in the university is often the best magnifying glass. But next, we go on to Angela. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi there. It's quite challenging to intervene with 2 very thorough and critical responses, and I'm wondering why I don't wholly subscribe to such pessimism. That's not to say that I've got optimism, but I think that there are several ways in which we still have to understand how neoliberalism has shaped the universities actually quite recently in the last 25 years, because prior to that, especially in the social sciences and arts humanities, we did have a lot of scope for critical work, a lot of scope for theoretical work. We had wonderful student bodies in the institutions I worked for. We were able to produce and generate generations of critical thinkers who have gone on to play very active roles in public sector work in many institutions. So we certainly, for sure at Goldsmiths, our students were being snapped up and were working right across the field from women's magazines to Channel 4. So, I feel that actually something much more precise and specific has happened in 20 years, even though there was that build-up. And as a sociologist, I think one task that we can set ourselves now is to really dissect that the parameters of how neoliberalism so thoroughly embedded itself in our institutions in a way that, as I think Adam pointed out, or Stephen, overseen by other bodies. So we were very much, there was management, of course. Where did these new management values come from? Did they come from the business schools? What kind of careers were being offered in university management training? Why was there such a close alignment of values? Why was there very little space for dissidence or for critical thinking within university management? Why did they all toe the line so thoroughly? Was it precisely, as I think Stephen pointed out, that people had really imbibed a kind of short-termism, do a job, make it look as though you filled various performances, indexes, and then move on to the next job? That could be true, but I think that we were absolutely in the faculties and as teachers, we were really faced with a multiplicity of different layers of institutions that all felt that for some reason neoliberalism could really be tried out and tested in our sector, whether it was in terms of university management, corporate values, paying vice-chancellors huge salaries. And why was that not so disputed right from the start? So there were so many things going on. And, were we voiceless or powerless? Or was it that the people that were being recruited to be vice-chancellors then found themselves all in hock to each other? But, we couldn't help but observe all around us massive overbuilding, huge overspends, upgrading campuses, so-called luxury student accommodation. What on earth is luxury student accommodation about? Spending huge amounts of money to attract students where a shabby old campus could still produce, including my own. And when I first came to Goldsmiths, we were in ramshackle buildings falling down and chairs that were falling to pieces, but we could do a very good job. And actually, Goldsmiths never went into huge overspend, but one couldn't help but observe this kind of a constant upgrading of the university environment, flashy places like kind of corporate suites and like flashy hotels and immaculate sports centers. So no wonder they now move into crisis. So, that was one huge mistake, which the vice-chancellors and the management, I think, are really accountable for. And we all now have to bear the consequences. But there were other factors. So I think there was management. There was also government wanting to privatize everything, and government wanting us to be left to our sink or swim kind of mentality, that competition is good. Students are now customers. And that really, I remember that absolutely driving me mad for the last decade. The vocabularies that were being kind of spelt out suddenly changed to being like a customer services department. So, we know all that, but I think it would also be interesting and important to look at the kind of political valency of the Office for Students, because it seems as though there was a sudden power was given to the Office for Students that it hadn't had in the past. So there were a kind of multiplicity of forces that really precipitated increasing powerlessness on the part of faculty. And there must have been business school vocabularies that were encouraging not just competition, but were encouraging a kind of distancing between faculty, teachers, and management. It's as though they were all kind of being lifted up and out and into these executive suites. Now, of course, there were some exceptions. And I actually recently interviewed the Vice-Chancellor, the former Vice-Chancellor of Glasgow University, Sir Anton Muscatelli, for the Journal of the British Academy. And that was a very interesting conversation we had. And I won't go on in great detail about it, but, he felt that the expansion of Glasgow University had been absolutely beneficial to the economic infrastructure of the city. And, he was full of enthusiasm for this massive expansion that changed employment, increased the skill set across, a substantial sector of people, and also working class people in Scotland. So, I was interested in his rather rosy account of what, if you like, a good vice chancellor could do. But we're now faced with a crisis that perhaps could have been foreseen. So I'll end up talking a little bit about my own institution. And I would say that from the early 2000s, and this is a different take from Stephen's, I think that we were actually able to develop a kind of pragmatic course through the neoliberalization of the university. We could calculate that if we set up MAs that we knew would be successful and would attract 200 students, we could calculate that we could make our balance sheet, that our spreadsheets would work. We were bringing money in. We would support other departments. So in my department, if the money was flowing in, then we knew that we could support departments in modern languages where perhaps there weren't so many students. And that really went on for a long time. What we couldn't anticipate, and what I think now leads to an absolute crisis situation, which really needs a more kind of ethical government response, is that we couldn't have foreseen how Brexit would have absolutely decimated the students that we got from all over Europe, for the reason that we offered courses that weren't available elsewhere. And we produced students that then could go back to Germany, could go back to Italy, and also be very employable. So we couldn't really have anticipated the downside of Brexit, where our European students disappeared 100%. We didn't have one European student on an MA in recent years. We couldn't have anticipated the downturn of international students, but also I think geography is a key factor in many of these crises. And we couldn't have really anticipated that the taking away the decapping of numbers meant that our rivals, that again, the ethos of competition, meant that comparable universities located in more beautiful parts of London could attract and could take a huge percentage of the students who in the past would have been happy to come to New Cross. So we find ourselves in this kind of terrible competition with universities like UCL, like King's, like LSE, which could offer greener, more beautiful luxury, so-called luxury accommodation. And then the final factor that is the one that I'm most kind of taken by as really intractable is that parents now have such a huge say on where their kids go to university for undergraduate. And sadly, parents want their children to go to green, pleasant, less urban, less gritty environments. So this also has worked against those of us who all learned to love New Cross and who were able to do fantastic things in New Cross. But the demographic is that parents began to see the neighbourhood as being not good enough, not comparable to the Strand and King's College. So it feels to me, and I've said this to the people that I speak with in management at Goldsmiths, it was a kind of intractable situation. You know, we worked incredibly hard, as Stephen said. We are all incredibly good citizens. We've done everything we can, but there is a set of circumstances that are completely beyond the control. And therefore, I think that's what calls for action which is more ethical and which would give time the universities, like a 5-year kind of plan to try and resolve, to create collaborations, to, if need be, join forces with other universities. And this would be my stance. If I was near to being a VC, or if I was on council as I was before, I would be saying, look, we need a 5-year plan to stop redundancies, to find new ways of navigating this kind of post-Brexit, post-international student environment. And that then might also give us time to think about lifelong learning, adult education, using the university again to develop its extramural resources. And actually, when the first lot of redundancies were announced, I wrote a piece that I think was circulated that was published in Verso. And that was where I really felt that there was a lack of imagination in management. You know, you can sell off buildings. We don't need all these buildings when students work in cafes or they work in the library. So I felt that there was all kinds of things that we could do that hadn't really been envisaged. And one of them was a lot more online cheap courses. It's better to do low fee, available teaching that is affordable than to shut the whole place down. Anyway, so that's my input.
No, thank you so much, Angela. And yeah, if people didn't see when I was circulating on my my Blue Sky promoting this panel, do check out the Goldsmith's Diary for Verso books. It's now in the chat, and I think it really does extend to, as Angela was saying, the necessity of place. And yeah, it's kind of depriving people of Deptford, especially sort of the new co-ops around there. I just want to shout out the Pie House in Deptford for if anyone there is listening or nearby. But next we have Giovanni.
First of all, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor but quite daunting task having to close the panel and have to follow up on such, I think as Angela put it, thoughtful interventions, and not least given that, unlike the other panelists, I have a relatively limited lived and theoretical understanding of some of the specific historical developments of leading to the current predicament. I've been employed in academia for about 10 years, so still quite new to the sector. I think it's also quite difficult to say something that hasn't already been said before about the crisis of universities in ways that are better than I could do myself. And I was going to say that perhaps one thing I would like to do for a start is to give a shout out to the Independent Social Research Foundation, which I assume many of us today know about, for the publication of a series of generally really helpful, I think, short reflections on the current state of higher education, especially in the UK, although I'm not completely sure if they only focus on the UK context, which is titled Dispatches Experiencing Academia's Decline. I've read a few, not all of them. Highly recommend. I don't necessarily agree with everything they said there, but I think they managed to assemble quite a good variety of perspectives I just find it a helpful resource. Trying to understand and wrap my head around. Seems to be a process that it's hard to see a coherent end goal, as has already been alluded to by the other interventions. I guess the first point to mention is that I feel like these are generally scary times, in the sense that it does feel like we're kind of enthusiastically internalized discipline that used to kind of be used to entice academics to do their duty and to be dutiful citizens of the university doesn't do the trick. Management appears to be completely unafraid of getting quite iron-fisted and overtly authoritarian. I mean, at the University of Edinburgh, where I work, the UCU has fairly recently launched a marking and assessment boycott, and management has responded without a hint of that could suggest being afraid of being perceived as authoritarian and with 100% deductions, and in a quite cunning way in many ways. So yeah, I think is to be said. I agree with what Angela was saying, that there seems to be a number of aspects that are generally relatively new to the sector that have contributed to the predicament we find ourselves in. At the same time, and I think these two things I'm about to say, I think I want to hold them together at once. That is true. At the same time, I do tend to agree with what John mentioned earlier, that the so-called modern university has always been a cog of capital accumulation, capital circulation, and ultimately a workplace where people are employed as workers. So yeah, so it seems to me that the management is no longer concerned about their perceived legitimacy among staff, which is a point that's been made also in broader terms about neoliberalism more generally. I think David Harvey's one that has made that point, for example. And I guess it seems to me they're not too shy about their agendas, and that the university's marketeering has become quite self-consciously hollow and quite kind of untethered from the necessity to prove some kind of social value. That's the impression I have. Kind of connected to that and to the shifts we're seeing, maybe this chimes a bit with what has already been said. I get the impression, and that impression frustrates me quite a bit, that academics, myself very much included, sometimes can tend to run to the defense of things that are somewhat dubious. One thing that I have in mind, for example, is a rhetoric that really is infused with the language of meritocracy, standards, quality, all these kinds of stuff that we bemoan, and I think in some ways rightly, but that we go to the defense of these values because what we're seeing is even worse than that, if that makes sense. And I think that's a bit worrying. I think that sometimes comes also with what I perceived as an own goal, which is pointing at the unfair or uneven distribution of resources across at the granular scale. I see here at the University of Edinburgh, where colleagues, in very well-intentioned way, they say, they've gutted our resources, but look, there's other courses that have all these resources and doing all that good work because they have those resources. And I think that's just tactically quite obtuse thing to do, in a sense that it draws a target onto those who are better resourced and kind of plays into a race to the bottom that seems to be the name of the game, cutting everywhere. There was something else that I think was mentioned again by Angela about the students' conflicting priorities and the kind of the consumer mentality, which also drives me quite up the walls. But I don't quite know what to do with it, because on the one hand, I work on a program that's called Design for Change that tries to put it briefly, that tries to understand the various ways in which design methods and sensibilities can kind of play a part in addressing complex socio-political, environmental issues. Another point that I was going to mention briefly is that, again, I think it was John who was touching on some of this, and maybe Stephen too. Certainly at Edinburgh, the centralized and increasingly impersonal nature of administrative work and professional services has academics and professional services. And I think this goes hand in hand with some of the dynamics that, for example, Soren Mao has described as through the Marxist idea of mute compulsion, where we see this kind of proliferation of leadership roles and middle management positions, which creates chains of power where each link can claim to have no say over what's happening, have their hands tied, and can only trickle down dictates from above. And in the process, there is no resistance all the way down. And I don't quite know what to make of it. I think in part, as Steve was saying, that's actually what's going on. On the other hand, I find it maddening is how little willingness or sense that one can say no to what is being imposed. And so that, I think, produces a sense of kind of entrapment by mechanics that are presented to us. Admissions in where we are is a clear example. There's a choice between admitting as many students as possible and raising programs' recruitment targets to impossible numbers so that they comply with staff-student ratio metrics and stuff like that, or insist on quality and smaller numbers and all the rest of it, and as a result face either cuts or simply being overturned, like just being told that, okay, these are who you want to admit, and these are the others that we want you to admit.